My son sent me a message that changed everything. Don't come back to the office. The board has decided. You're finished. I stared at the screen, not angry, just very calm. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I typed a single word, okay. Then I put the phone down, wiped the grease from my hands, and started setting things in motion. By sunrise, his phone was exploding with missed calls. By the time he realized something was wrong, the company was already gone. Because when you push out the man who built the foundation, the collapse is never loud. It's total. Before we go any further, I just want to say thank you for being here. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I really do read them all. And just so we're clear, this story includes some fictionalized elements added for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidental, but the message behind it is very real. It was a Tuesday morning hot enough to fry an egg on the asphalt of the West Logistics lot in Lubbock, Texas. At 78, most men with my net worth are sitting in air-conditioned country clubs drinking iced tea and complaining about their hips. Not me. I was knee-deep in grease sliding out from under the chassis of a Peterbilt 389. This truck was number one, the first rig I ever bought back in '74. We kept her running for parades and funerals, but I liked to check her bearings myself. The smell of diesel and axle grease is better than any expensive cologne my daughter-in-law tries to buy me for Christmas. I wiped my hands on a shop rag, feeling the satisfying ache in my shoulders. The yard was buzzing. Forklifts were moving pallets, and the rumble of idling engines was music to my ears. I built this. Every square inch of this 20-acre lot, every tire, every contract. I built it while raising Preston alone after his mother Martha passed. I gave that boy everything. Private schools, an MBA from UT Austin, and eventually the title of CEO. I thought I was giving him a legacy. I did not realize I was handing a loaded gun to a child. My phone vibrated on the metal workbench next to a socket wrench. It was an old, rugged flip phone. Preston always made fun of it, telling me I needed a smartphone to keep up with the synergy of the modern world. I flipped it open. The screen was small, pixelated, and bright. The message was from Preston. Dad, do not come to the office today. The board held an emergency session this morning. Effective immediately, you have been removed as chairman. Security has been notified to escort you off the premises if you try to enter. We are rebranding to a tech-focused model. Your access is revoked. Go home and rest. I read it twice, then a third time. The sounds of the yard seemed to fade away, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. It was not the heat. It was the audacity. Security has been notified. Security, the head of security, was a man named Miller, who I hired when he came back from Iraq, with nowhere else to go. And now my son was telling me that Miller would throw me out of the company I built with my bare hands. My hand started to shake. It was a subtle tremor at first, rattling the phone against the workbench. A younger man might have mistaken it for fear or shock, but I knew what it was. It was rage. Cold, hard Texas rage. Preston did not even have the courage to tell me to my face. He sent a text message. He probably typed it from the safety of his glass-walled office, with Tiffany whispering in his ear about how I was holding them back, how I was an old dinosaur who did not understand blockchain or cloud logistics. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of oil and dust. I looked at the keypad. I could have called him. I could have stormed into that office and broken his nose. I still had the strength to do it. But shouting is for men who have no power. Silence is for the man who holds the keys. I typed 4 letters. OKAAY. Send. I closed the phone and slipped it into the pocket of my coveralls. I did not go to the main building. I did not go to my office to collect my things. I did not need the picture frames or the awards on the wall. Those were just decorations. The real power was not in that building. I walked over to my personal truck, a Ford F-250 that had seen better days, and climbed in. I tossed the shop rag on the passenger seat. As I drove out of the side gate, I saw the new security guard, a kid I did not recognize, eyeing me suspiciously. Preston moved fast. He must have replaced Miller already. Good. That meant the gloves were off. I did not turn left toward my house. I turned right, merging onto the highway, heading straight for downtown. My destination was First Texas Bank. The drive gave me time to think, which was dangerous for Preston. I remembered the conversation we had last Sunday dinner. Tiffany had been talking about liquidating the heavy haul division. She called it dirty money. She wanted to pivot to a software-as-a-service model, whatever that meant. She wanted to sell the trucks. My trucks. The trucks that carried steel for bridges, parts for wind turbines, the literal backbone of this state. I told them no. I slammed my hand on the table and told them as long as I breathed. West Logistics hauled heavy. Preston had looked down at his plate, spineless as ever. Tiffany had just smirked. Now I knew why. They had been planning this coup for months. I pulled into the bank parking lot. The heat was radiating off the pavement. I walked into the lobby still wearing my grease-stained coveralls. The young teller at the front looked like he was about to ask me if I was lost, but then Mrs. Higgins, the branch manager, stepped out of her office. "Mr. West," she said, smiling warmly, "we were not expecting you today. Would you like some coffee?" "No, thank you, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I just need to access my safety deposit box, number 404. "Of course. Right this way." She led me into the vault. It was cool inside, quiet as a tomb. That was fitting. I was about to bury my son's future in here. She used her master key, and I used mine. She slid the long metal box out and placed it on the table, then respectfully left the room to give me privacy. I sat down and opened the lid. Inside there was no cash, no gold, no jewelry. Just a single thick manila envelope labeled Omega. I created the Omega file 10 years ago, right after Preston married Tiffany. Call it a father's intuition. I wanted to trust them. I wanted to believe that Preston would grow a backbone, and that Tiffany would learn to love the business, not just the bank account. But I am a man who prepares for the worst-case scenario. In trucking, if you lose your brakes on a downhill grade, you need an emergency plan. This file was my emergency plan. I pulled out the documents. On top was the deed of trust for the land the headquarters sat on. Underneath that were the titles to every single truck in the fleet, 200 of them. And at the very bottom was the original operating agreement of the company with a clause I had inserted in fine print on page 42, the conduct clause. It stated that the transfer of voting shares to my son was revocable in the event of gross mismanagement or actions deemed harmful to the founder's legacy. Preston thought he owned the company because he had the title of CEO and sat in the big chair. He forgot that a company is just a name. The assets, the land, the machines, the blood and bone of the business, those belonged to a holding company. Harlon Asset Holdings. And Harlon Asset Holdings had one shareholder. Me. I took the papers and placed them in my leather satchel. Then I took my phone out of my pocket one last time. I looked at it. It was still silent. Preston probably thought I was at home crying in my recliner. He probably thought he had won. I popped the back cover off the phone and removed the battery. Then I slid out the small SIM card. This little chip was the only leash they had on me. It was how they tracked me, how they called me when they needed money, how they kept tabs on the old man. I held the SIM card between my thumb and forefinger. I thought about the time Preston was 5 years old and scraped his knee, and I carried him half a mile home. I thought about the time I paid off his college debts. I thought about the betrayal in that text message. I snapped the SIM card in half. It made a sharp, satisfying click. I dropped the pieces into the trash can in the corner of the vault. Silence is the loudest sound in the world when you are about to drop a hammer. I was ghosting them. No phone, no email, no location. As far as they were concerned, Harlon West had disappeared. I walked out of the bank satchel in hand. The sun was high in the sky now. It was a beautiful day for a war. I climbed back into my truck and started the engine. I wasn't going home. I had a meeting to make, and it wasn't with a doctor or a therapist. It was with a man named Henderson, the meanest lawyer in the state of Texas, and the only man I trusted to help me pull the trigger. Preston wanted a tech company fine. By tomorrow morning, he would have all the technology in the world, but he wouldn't have a single truck to move it or a building to put it in. I put the truck in gear. The Omega Protocol had officially begun. The drive to the headquarters of West Logistics took 20 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime of memories flashing by the window of my Ford F-250. Every mile of asphalt between the bank and the office was a road my trucks had driven 1,000 times. I built that building in 1998. I remembered pouring the concrete for the foundation. I remembered the day we cut the ribbon with Martha standing beside me holding a pair of oversized scissors and laughing as the wind messed up her hair. It was a monument to hard work, to grit, and to the American dream. Now, as I turned into the entrance, it looked like a fortress designed to keep me out. The sign out front had already been changed. The bold blue block letters that simply said West Logistics were gone. In their place was a sleek, minimalist silver logo that looked like a cloud with the words West Tech Global underneath. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. They had not just fired me, they were erasing me. I parked my truck in the spot nearest the door. The pavement was painted with the words "Reserved for Founder," but a shiny new Tesla Model S was parked diagonally across it, forcing me to squeeze my beat-up work truck onto the grass. The disrespect was calculated. It was precise. I grabbed my satchel, the one containing the Omega file, and stepped out into the humid Texas air. I was still wearing my grease-stained coveralls. I looked like a mechanic, not the man who owned the deed to the land under my feet. I walked up to the double glass doors, the ones with the automatic sensors I had installed myself to save on electricity costs. I pulled my keycard from my wallet. It was an old card worn at the edges with a photo of me from 20 years ago. I held it up to the black reader mounted on the wall. Beep. A red light flashed. Access denied. I frowned and wiped the card on my sleeve, thinking it was just a smudge of oil. I held it up again. Beep. Red light. Access denied. Then a sound erupted that made my stomach drop. It was not a polite buzz. It was the security breach siren. A loud oscillating wail that echoed across the entire parking lot. Inside the building, heads popped up over the gray cubicle walls. I saw faces I recognized. There was Brenda from accounting, who I had helped pay for her husband's surgery. There was Jim from dispatch, who I had hired when he got out of prison, and nobody else would give him a chance. They looked at me through the glass, their eyes wide with confusion and pity. They saw their boss, the old lion, standing outside the door, while a siren screamed at him like he was a common criminal trying to break in. I stood my ground. I did not bang on the glass. I did not shout. I just stood there letting the humiliation wash over me. This was Preston's doing. He wanted to show the staff that the old guard was gone. He wanted to shame me into disappearing. The siren continued to wail for a full minute, drawing every eye in the complex, before it finally cut off, leaving a ringing silence in the air. The automatic doors slid open, but it was not to welcome me. Two men stepped out first. They were not my security team. They were private contractors, young, muscular, wearing tight black tactical shirts and sunglasses, looking like they were ready to take down a terrorist, not a 78-year-old man. Behind them walked Tiffany. My daughter-in-law looked like she had just stepped out of a magazine photo shoot. She was wearing a white tailored suit that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. Her heels clicked sharply on the concrete as she approached. She stopped 5 feet away from me, maintaining a safe distance as if poverty and old age were contagious diseases. In her hands, she held a small, battered cardboard box. "This is private property, Harlon," she said. Her voice was calm, practiced, devoid of any warmth. "We sent the termination notice to your email. Your access privileges have been revoked. If you refuse to leave, these gentlemen have been authorized to physically remove you." I looked at the 2 guards. They shifted their weight hands, hovering near their belts. I looked back at Tiffany. "Is this necessary?" "Tiffany," I asked, my voice low. "I just came for my things." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "We anticipated that. We packed your personal effects for you. We cannot have unauthorized personnel wandering the floor. It disrupts the workflow." She extended her arms, holding the box out. I stepped forward to take it. It was a heavy box. Inside were the few things that mattered to me in that office. My Vietnam service medals. The Purple Heart I earned in the jungle in '68. And the framed photograph of Martha, the one taken right before the cancer, took her where she was smiling despite the pain. As my hands reached for the box, Tiffany let go. She did not hand it to me. She dropped it. Time seemed to slow down. I watched the box fall the 3 feet between her manicured hands and the hard concrete. It hit the ground with a sickening thud, followed immediately by the sharp, distinct sound of shattering glass. "Oops," Tiffany said. Her tone was flat. "Clumsy me." I looked down. The box had landed on its side. The contents spilled out onto the pavement. My Purple Heart lay in the dirt. The frame holding Martha's picture had cracked right down the middle, a jagged spiderweb of fractured glass obscuring her face. I felt a heat rise in my chest that was hotter than the Texas sun. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. The 2 guards stepped closer, sensing the shift in my energy, ready to pounce if the old man tried anything. Tiffany looked down at the mess she had made and shrugged. "You should really upgrade your storage, Harlon. That frame was ancient. But then again, you hold on to a lot of ancient things, don't you? Like this company. Like your outdated ideas." She took a step back, crossing her arms. "Go home, Harlon. Your era is over. Look at you. You are covered in grease. You are an embarrassment to the brand we are trying to build. This is the digital age. We don't need mechanics. We need visionaries." I stared at the broken glass. For a moment I thought about the power I had in my satchel. I thought about the Omega file. I could have pulled out the deed right there. I could have told her that she was standing on my land. I could have fired her on the spot. But no, that would be too easy. That would be a temper tantrum. I needed to destroy them completely, and to do that, I needed them to think they had won. I needed them to overextend. Slowly, painfully, I bent my knees. My joints popped audibly in the silence. I crouched down on the hot pavement in front of my daughter-in-law and her hired muscle. I reached out and picked up the Purple Heart, brushing the dust off the ribbon with my thumb. Then I reached for Martha's picture. A shard of glass sliced into my finger, drawing a bead of blood. I didn't flinch. I let the blood drip onto the pavement. I carefully placed the photo back in the box, along with my other trinkets. I stood up, holding the box against my chest with my grease-stained hands. I looked Tiffany in the eye. She was smirking, checking her notifications on her smartwatch, clearly bored with the interaction. Then movement caught my eye. I looked up past Tiffany, past the guards, to the second floor, to the corner office. My office. The blinds were drawn, but one slat was pulled down. Behind the glass, I saw a face. Preston. My son. He was watching. He was hiding in the shadows of the air-conditioned office, watching his wife humiliate his father in the parking lot. Our eyes locked across the distance. Even from down here, I could see the fear in him. He looked pale. As soon as he realized I saw him, he let go of the blind, and stepped back, disappearing into the darkness of the room. He couldn't even face me. He let his wife do the dirty work while he cowered behind the glass. That was the moment the last shred of hesitation left my body. Up until that second, I think a small part of me was still hoping for an apology, hoping he would run out the door and stop this. But he didn't. He hid. I turned my attention back to Tiffany. She was tapping her foot. "Are we done here?" she asked. "I have a Zoom call with investors in 5 minutes." I adjusted the box in my arms. I looked at the sleek building, the new logo, the Tesla, and the woman who thought she was the future. Digital age. I repeated, my voice rough like gravel in a mixer. "You keep talking about numbers, Tiffany. About efficiency. About modernizing." I took a step closer to her. The guards tensed, but I didn't raise a hand. I just leaned in so only she could hear me. "I hope you are good at math," I whispered. She frowned, confused. "Excuse me? I hope you are good at math," I said louder this time, letting my voice carry to the employees watching from the windows. "Because when you subtract the assets from the liabilities and you divide by zero loyalty, you don't get a profit, Tiffany. You get a remainder. And right now you are standing on a remainder." I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned my back on her. I walked to my Ford F-250, threw the box of broken memories onto the passenger seat, and climbed in. As I started the engine, I saw Tiffany laughing, shaking her head, as if I were a senile old fool mumbling nonsense. She turned and walked back toward the glass doors, her high heels clicking, confident that she had just taken out the trash. She had no idea. I put the truck in reverse and backed out. I checked the time on the dashboard clock. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I had about 4 hours before the banks closed. 4 hours to prepare the battlefield. My phone was still in my pocket, dead and broken without its SIM card. But as I drove away from the company I built, I didn't feel lonely. I felt focused. The humiliation in the parking lot had clarified everything. They wanted a war, they just got one. But they were fighting with slide decks and buzzwords. I was about to fight with leverage and debt. I turned onto the main road and headed toward my house. I needed to wait for Preston's call. The fake apology call. The one where he would try to smooth things over with a lie. I knew it was coming. It was part of their script. But what they didn't know was that I had already rewritten the ending. The first domino had fallen. Now I just had to wait for the lie. The house was quiet when I walked in, that heavy, suffocating silence that only exists in a home where children used to laugh, but now only ghosts remain. I threw my keys on the counter and walked into the kitchen. My cell phone was dead in my pocket, the SIM card snapped in two, but I knew they would find a way to reach me. They needed to make sure the old dog was staying in the yard. Right on cue, the landline on the wall began to ring. It was a beige rotary phone I had kept since 1985. Preston used to play with the cord while I cooked dinner. Now that same cord felt like a noose they were trying to tighten around my neck. I let it ring 3 times, 4 times. I poured myself a glass of water from the tap, taking a slow sip, before I finally reached out and lifted the receiver. "Hello," I said. "Dad. Is that you?" It was Preston. His voice was breathless, pitched high. If I didn't know better, I would have thought he was crying. It was a performance. I could hear the hesitation, the calculated pauses he had probably rehearsed in the mirror. "Preston," I said. "Oh God. Dad, I am so sorry about what happened at the lot today. Tiffany, she just gets so protective of the brand. She didn't mean to drop your things. It was an accident." I leaned against the counter, watching a fly buzz against the window screen. An accident. Just like it was an accident when they forgot my birthday last year. Just like it was an accident when they moved my office to the basement 3 months ago. "Why are you calling Preston?" I asked. "I just wanted to explain, Dad. You have to understand the pressure we are under. The investors, they are worried. They look at the market trends and they see a 78-year-old chairman and they get nervous. They think the company can't pivot fast enough with you at the helm. It's nothing personal. It's just optics. Optics. That was his favorite word lately. So you fired me because of optics, I said flatly. We didn't fire you. We are just transitioning you. Look, Dad, we want you to enjoy your life. You worked so hard. You deserve to rest. Go fishing. Go to that cabin in Montana you always talk about. We are going to take care of you. I waited. I knew the number was coming. The bribe. The board approved a severance package. Preston continued, his voice rushing now, eager to get to the good news. We are going to set up a monthly stipend for you. $5,000 a month, Dad. Tax-free. You won't have to lift a finger. Just sign the non-disclosure agreement and the non-compete, and the money starts flowing tomorrow. I closed my eyes. $5,000. West Logistics did $80 million in revenue last year. The heavy haul division, alone the one I managed personally, brought in $40 million of that pure profit. I had drivers who made more than $5,000 a month. And here was my son, the boy I taught to ride a bike, offering me an allowance like I was a teenager mowing lawns. 5,000, I repeated. It is a generous offer, Dad, Preston said, and for the first time a sharp edge of impatience cut through his fake sympathy. Most retired founders don't get half that. Consider it a thank you for your service. A thank you for my service. Like I was a discharged soldier being sent home with a pat on the back. I will think about it, I said. Good. That is good. Just stay home, okay? Don't come back to the office. It just upsets the staff. We will courier the papers over for you to sign. Love you, Dad. The line went dead. I hung up the phone. I stood there for a long time, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. $5,000 a month. The math didn't add up. I am not a forensic accountant, but I know money. I know that if a company is making $80 million a year, you don't offer the founder who still owns the majority of the voting trust a measly $60,000 a year to go away. You offer him a buyout. You offer him millions to surrender his shares. You offer him a golden parachute, unless you don't have the money. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If they were lowballing me this hard, it wasn't just disrespect. It was desperation. They were trying to buy me off cheap because they couldn't afford to pay me what I was worth. Where was the money? I left the kitchen and walked down the hall to my study. This was my sanctuary. Dark wood paneling, bookshelves filled with technical manuals and maps of the interstate highway system. On the heavy oak desk sat my computer. It wasn't a sleek laptop like the one Preston used. It was a custom-built tower with 3 monitors, a machine I used to track the fleet and monitor fuel costs. I sat down in my leather chair and woke the machine up. The screens hummed to life. I cracked my knuckles and navigated to the company's remote login portal. I typed in my username, HWestAdmin. I typed in my password, one I had used for 10 years. Access denied. I tried again. Maybe my finger slipped. Access denied. User account has been disabled. Contact system administrator. I stared at the red letters. They hadn't just fired me. They had locked me out of the digital infrastructure. They thought that by changing a password, they could blind me. They thought that because they bought new servers and installed new software, I was helpless. But they forgot one thing. They forgot who laid the cables. Back in '98, when we built the headquarters, I didn't trust the cloud. I didn't trust third-party vendors. I insisted on having a hardline physical server room in the basement. And because I wanted to be able to check on the building during storms or power outages, I had the technicians install a hard-wired backdoor. It wasn't a software vulnerability. It was a static IP address, a direct line to the security subsystem that bypassed the main network entirely. It was designed for maintenance raw and ugly, A command line interface that looked like something from the Cold War. Preston didn't know about it. Tiffany definitely didn't know about it. To them, if it wasn't an app on their phone, it didn't exist. I opened the command prompt. The black box appeared on the screen, a blinking white cursor waiting for orders. I typed in the IP address. 192.168.4. Connecting. A prompt appeared asking for a root key. This wasn't a password you could change from a dashboard. This was a 16-digit hex code that was physically etched onto the motherboard of the server. I had it memorized. I typed the code. Access granted. System security and surveillance subsystem alpha. I didn't smile. I didn't have time to celebrate. I navigated through the directories, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. I wasn't looking for spreadsheets yet. I was looking for eyes. I accessed the camera feed. Camera 1 lobby. Empty. Camera 2 parking lot. My grease stain was still there. Camera 3 boardroom. I hit enter. The center monitor flickered gray static washing over it for a second before the image resolved into sharp, high-definition color. The boardroom. The place where I had negotiated contracts that built this town. And there they were. Preston was sitting at the head of the table, my seat. He had his head in his hands. Tiffany was pacing back and forth, holding a glass of what looked like scotch. There were papers scattered everywhere. I turned up the volume. The audio feed from the omnidirectional microphone in the center of the table crackled to life. Told you he would take the deal, Preston was saying. His voice muffled. He is old. He is tired. 5,000 is a lot of money to him. He better take it, Tiffany snapped. She stopped pacing and slammed her hand on the table. Because we need his signature on that release form by Friday. If we don't have clear title to the shares, the merger with Red Rock won't go through. Red Rock. The name hit me like a physical blow. Red Rock Transport was our biggest competitor. They were a predatory firm known for stripping assets, firing drivers, and cutting corners on safety. I had spent 20 years fighting them, keeping them out of our territory. And now my daughter-in-law was talking about a merger. But we can't merge yet, Preston whined. The audit TIF, the missing funds. If the Red Rock accountants see the books for the Nexus project. Shut up, Tiffany hissed, looking at the door as if she expected someone to burst in. They won't see the books. That is why we are moving the cash reserves to the holding company in Delaware. By the time due diligence starts, Nexus Tech will look like a legitimate R&D expense. We just need to clear the accounts before the bank snapshot at midnight. I leaned closer to the screen. Cash reserves. Moving to Delaware. They weren't merging. They were looting. They were going to drain the company dry, sell the empty husk to Red Rock, and leave me the employees and the creditors holding the bag. That was why they offered me $5,000. They needed me to sign away my rights, so I couldn't sue them when the ship went down. I checked the time on my computer. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. Preston mentioned the bank snapshot at midnight. That meant I had less than 9 hours. I minimized the camera window but kept the audio running in the background. I opened a new terminal window. I needed to see exactly how much they were moving. I needed to see the bleeding. I typed in a new command querying the internal accounting logs. The text scrolled by faster than most people could read, but I saw the numbers. Pending transaction, up to $15,000, recipient Nexus Tech LLC. Status awaiting final authorization. $15 million. That was our entire operating capital. That was the money for fuel, for tires, for payroll. If that money left, the account checks would bounce by Friday. The company would be insolvent instantly. I sat back in my chair. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my mind was crystal clear. Preston said I was too old. Tiffany said I was obsolete. They thought I was sitting at home grateful for their charity. I reached into my drawer and pulled out a fresh notepad. I picked up a pen. They wanted a signature, I would give them a signature. But it wasn't going to be on a release form. I reached for the phone again. Not to call Preston. I dialed a number I hadn't used in years, but I knew he would answer. "Henderson," I said when the line clicked open. Harlon, the voice on the other end, rasped. It sounded like gravel and whiskey. "I haven't heard from you since the ribbons were cut." "Dust off your suit, Saul," I said. "We have a breach of contract. And bring the foreclosure papers." "Foreclosure? On who? On my son?" I hung up. On the screen, Tiffany was pouring herself another drink. She looked confident. She looked victorious. "Enjoy that drink, sweetheart," I whispered to the monitor. "It is going to be the most expensive scotch you ever had. $15 million. The number sat on my computer screen, glowing in neon green against the black background of the command terminal. It was a number that represented 40 years of sweat-missed birthdays and broken bones. It was the liquidity that kept West Logistics alive during the recessions of 2008 and 2020. And now it was sitting in a digital queue, waiting for a final authorization key to vanish forever into the ether. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes narrowing as I dissected the transaction details. The recipient was Nexus Tech, LLC. The address listed was a generic post office box in Wilmington, Delaware. I knew exactly what that meant. Delaware is the capital of corporate anonymity. You can set up a shell company there in 20 minutes without ever putting your name on a public document. It is a black hole for money. If that $15 million left my company's operating account and landed in Nexus Tech, it would be washed, tumbled, and moved offshore before the sun came up tomorrow. I typed a command to query the metadata of the transfer request. I needed to know who initiated it. The system processed for a second before spitting out a user ID. West CEO, my son. Preston had authorized the transfer using his executive credentials, but as I looked at the timestamp, something didn't sit right. The request was created 3 weeks ago, but it had been modified just 2 hours ago. The modification was an override of the standard accounting protocols, bypassing the CFO's approval. Preston didn't know how to do that. He barely knew how to use Excel. Someone else had guided his hand. Someone who knew exactly how to dismantle a company from the inside out. I reached for the phone again. My hand was steady, but my heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I dialed Henderson. It was late past dinner time, but Henderson was the kind of lawyer who slept with his phone on his chest. He answered on the second ring. "I found the leak, Saul," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "They are moving the reserves. 15 million to a shell in Delaware called Nexus Tech. I need you to run a skip trace on the registered agent. I need to know who is behind the curtain." I heard the rustle of papers and the click of a keyboard on the other end. Henderson didn't ask questions. He just worked. While he typed, I kept my eyes on the surveillance feed in the corner of my screen. In the boardroom, the celebration was dying down. Preston was looking at his watch, looking nervous. Tiffany was on her phone, typing furiously. She looked like a predator waiting for a trap to spring. It took Henderson 4 minutes. 4 minutes to unravel a lie they probably spent months constructing. Harlan Henderson's voice came through the speaker, low and gravelly. "You are not going to like this. Nexus Tech isn't just a blind shell." I pulled the initial incorporation filings. They were sloppy. They used a registered agent who shares an address with a residential property in Boca Raton, Florida. "Who owns the property?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling in my gut. "The deed belongs to a woman named Linda D'Amato," Henderson said. I closed my eyes. Linda D'Amato. Tiffany's mother. The woman who had worn a red dress to my son's wedding and complained that the champagne wasn't French enough. "It is embezzlement, Saul," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It isn't a strategic pivot. It isn't a tech investment. They are stealing the cash reserves and funneling it to her family. It is worse than embezzlement, Harlan Henderson replied. It is wire fraud. It is conspiracy. And since Preston used his credentials to authorize the transfer, he is the one who is going to go down for it. Tiffany kept her name off everything. If the feds look at this, they will see your son robbing the company blind, and his wife will look like an innocent bystander who just happens to have a wealthy mother. Silence hung heavy on the line. I looked at the screen again. I looked at Preston. He was sitting there, spinning a pen between his fingers, completely oblivious. He thought he was making a business deal. He thought he was proving himself to me. He didn't realize he was digging his own grave, and his wife was the one handing him the shovel. "Can we stop it?" I asked. "Legally." "Not quickly enough," Henderson said. "We can file an emergency injunction, but that takes time. By the time a judge signs the order, that money will be in the Cayman Islands. Unless you have another way." "I have another way," I said. "I will call you back." I hung up the phone and sat back in the darkness of my study. The glow of the monitors was the only light in the room. I swiveled my chair away from the digital crime scene and looked at the bookshelf against the wall. There, nestled between a manual on diesel engine repair and a model of a Peterbilt truck, was a framed photograph. It was an old photo, faded by the sun. It was taken 30 years ago. I was younger then, my hair still black, my back straight. I was crouching down next to a 12-year-old Preston. We were by the lake, and he was holding up a bass he had just caught. It was a tiny fish, barely legal size, but the smile on his face was wide and genuine. He looked at me with so much trust in that picture. He looked at me like I was Superman. I reached out and picked up the frame. I ran my thumb over the glass. Where had that boy gone? When did he become this weak, easily manipulated man who would sell his father's legacy for a pat on the head from a woman who didn't love him? I felt a tear well up in my eye, hot and stinging. I quickly wiped it away. This wasn't the time for grief. This was the time for surgery. I was facing the hardest decision of my life. If I let this transaction go through, the company would die. The employees would lose their jobs. But Preston might get away with it for a while. He would have the money. He would have the lifestyle Tiffany promised him, until the IRS caught up, until the creditors came knocking. Then he would go to federal prison for 10 years. He wouldn't survive a week in prison. He was too soft. But if I stopped him now, I would have to destroy him. I would have to humiliate him. I would have to take away his title, his money, his house, and his pride. I would have to prove to the world that he was incompetent. I would have to break his heart to save his life. I looked at the boy in the photo one last time. I remembered teaching him how to drive a stick shift. I remembered telling him that a man is only as good as his word. Somewhere inside that suit-wearing executive, my son was still in there. He was just buried under layers of greed and manipulation. "I have to kill the executive to save the son," I whispered to the empty room. It was a brutal logic, the kind of logic you learn when you are hauling 80,000 pounds of steel down an icy mountain pass. Sometimes you have to steer into the skid to save the truck. Sometimes you have to cause a crash to prevent a disaster. I set the photo down. The sentimentality evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was the chairman. And I had a duty to the 200 families that relied on West Logistics for their paychecks. I wouldn't let Tiffany and her mother turn my life's work into a retirement fund for grifters. I turned back to the computer. The cursor was still blinking next to the $15 million figure. I opened the banking portal. I didn't have the authority to cancel the transaction directly. Preston had revoked my admin privileges on the account. But I didn't need to cancel the transaction. I just needed to make sure there was no road for the money to travel on. I pulled the master lease agreement from my digital files, the clause I had mentioned to Henderson. The nuclear option. Harlon Asset Holdings owns the physical collateral, I muttered to myself, reciting the legal text I had memorized. In the event of unauthorized financial restructuring, the guarantor reserves the right to freeze all associated credit lines and seize physical assets to secure the debt. I was the guarantor. I wasn't going to sue them. I was going to foreclose on them. I was going to pull the rug out so hard they wouldn't know they had fallen until they hit the floor. I started typing the notification email to the bank's risk management department. I attached the proof of the suspicious transfer to Nexus Tech. I attached the affidavit Henderson had just sent me regarding the ownership of the shell company. And finally, I attached the kill switch order, a formal demand to freeze the corporate line of credit immediately. It was 3:55 p.m. The bank closed at 4:00 p.m. I hit send. The email swooshed away. I sat there watching the clock tick. 3:56, 3:57. At 3:59 my phone buzzed. It was an automated alert from First Texas Bank. Alert credit facility West Log 01 has been suspended. All pending outbound wire transfers have been halted, pending review. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The $15 million was stuck. It was trapped in the pipe. Tiffany wouldn't get her payday. But the war wasn't over. I had stopped the money, but they still had the building. They still had the trucks. They still thought they were in charge. I looked at the surveillance feed. Preston was smiling, shaking hands with the CFO, thinking the deal was done. He had no idea he was already dead in the water. Now came the hard part. The physical dismantling. I picked up the phone again. It was time to call Mike. It was time to turn off the lights. The Ghost Fleet protocol was next. If they wanted to play games with invisible money, I was going to show them what happens when invisible trucks stop moving. I stood up and walked to the window looking out at the Texas sunset. It was blood red. Fitting. I am sorry, Preston, I said to the glass. This is going to hurt you more than it hurts me. But one day you will thank me. I turned off the lights in the study, plunging the room into darkness, leaving only the blinking cursor of the terminal as a silent witness to the carnage that was about to unfold. The sound of gravel crunching under tires announced Henderson's arrival before I even saw his headlights. He drove a 1985 Lincoln Town Car, a vehicle as stubborn and heavy as the man driving it. I met him at the door. Saul Henderson was 75, wore suspenders that looked older than my son, and carried a leather briefcase that had seen the inside of more courtrooms than most judges. He didn't offer a handshake. He just walked past me into the study smelling of cigar smoke and Old Spice and dropped the briefcase onto my desk with a heavy thud. We didn't waste time with small talk. Henderson knew exactly why he was here. He snapped the latches open and pulled out a stack of documents bound in blue legal covers. These weren't digital files. These were the original physical contracts signed in wet ink 10 years ago, the day I supposedly handed over the reins to Preston. Preston had likely never read them. He was too busy looking at the revenue projections to worry about the fine print. But Henderson and I had spent 3 weeks drafting that fine print. Henderson spread the documents out on the oak desk. He pointed a thick, callous finger at the top document. It was the master lease agreement. This was the trapdoor Preston didn't know he was standing on. See, my son was the CEO of West Logistics, the operating company. West Logistics hired the drivers, managed the contracts, and collected the shipping fees. But West Logistics didn't own anything tangible. It didn't own the headquarters building. It didn't own the maintenance bays. And most importantly, it didn't own a single one of the 200 Peterbilt tractors sitting in the yard. All of those assets belonged to Harlon Asset Holdings. And Harlon Asset Holdings was a completely separate entity, one that I owned 100%. Henderson tapped the paper. Clause 14, Section C. He grunted. Read it out loud, Harlon. It sounds like poetry. I put on my reading glasses and leaned in. The text was dense, written in the dry language of corporate law, but to me it read like a declaration of war. It stated that the lease for all physical assets, including real estate and rolling stock, was contingent upon the continued employment and executive authority of the guarantor. The guarantor was me. It means, Henderson said, leaning back in my leather chair, that the moment they voted you out of the chairmanship, they violated the lease. West Logistics is currently occupying your building and driving your trucks illegally. They are squatters, Harlon, and you have the right to evict them. I looked at the document. It was ruthless. It was brilliant. Preston thought he had fired me from my own company. He didn't realize that without me, his company was just a ghost. It was a software program with no hardware to run on. We moved to the next document. The Fleet Utilization Agreement. This was even deadlier. It stated that if the lessee West Logistics engaged in any financial malfeasance or unauthorized asset transfers, the lessor me had the right to immediately immobilize the fleet to preserve the value of the collateral. Henderson looked at me over the rim of his glasses. The unauthorized transfer to Nexus Tech. That is your trigger. They tried to move $15 million. That is a material breach of contract. You don't just have the right to stop them. You have a fiduciary duty to stop them. I nodded slowly. The weight of what I was about to do settled on my shoulders. I wasn't just stopping a bank transfer. I was pulling the plug on the entire operation. I was about to strand millions of dollars of freight on highways across America. I was about to cause chaos. But as I looked at the papers, I remembered the sound of the glass breaking in the parking lot. I remembered Tiffany's smirk. I remembered Preston hiding in the window. "Let's write it," I said. I pulled the keyboard closer. Henderson dictated, and I typed. We didn't use legal jargon meant to confuse. We used clear, sharp language meant to cut. To the Board of Directors of West Logistics, the letter began. Reference is made to the Master Lease Agreement dated July 12, 2014. Notice is hereby given that due to the removal of Harlon West as chairman and the subsequent attempted unauthorized transfer of capital reserves to Nexus Tech, LLC, you are in immediate default. My fingers flew across the keys. Every word felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. Pursuant to Clause 14, the lease for the property located at 400 Industrial Way is terminated effective immediately. You are ordered to vacate the premises. Furthermore, pursuant to the Fleet Utilization Agreement, all rights to operate the rolling stock are revoked. I stopped typing and looked at Henderson. Is that enough? He shook his head and pulled a cigar from his pocket, though he didn't light it. Not yet. You need to hit them where they breathe. The money. If they have access to the credit line, they can rent other trucks. They can fight you in court for months. You need to starve them out tonight. I opened a new window. This was the email to the bank, specifically to the Risk Management Division of First Texas Bank. I had been banking with them for 40 years. I knew the VP of Risk, a man named Sterling, personally. We played poker on Thursdays. But this wasn't a friendly email. This was a formal demand. Subject: immediate freeze of credit facility, West Logistics. I attached the drafted notice of default. I attached the evidence of the Nexus Tech transfer. And then I wrote the body of the email. As the personal guarantor of the $20 million revolving credit line for West Logistics, I am formally notifying the bank of a material adverse change in the borrower's condition. I am revoking my guarantee. Freeze the line. Dishonor any outbound checks presented after 4:00 p.m. today. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3:52 in the afternoon. The bank closed at 4. If I sent this now, Sterling would see it. He would have to act. Bank regulations were strict. If a guarantor pulls out and alleges fraud, they have to lock the account down to protect the bank's exposure. It is automatic. It is instantaneous. Preston and Tiffany were probably popping champagne right now. They thought they had until tomorrow to move the money. They thought they had time to cover their tracks. They didn't know that the ceiling was about to collapse on them in 8 minutes. My mouse hovered over the send button. Henderson stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the long driveway. He didn't say anything. He knew this was hard. He knew I was effectively bankrupting my own son. But he also knew that if I didn't do this, Preston would go to jail for what Tiffany was making him do. This was the only way to save him from himself. I thought about the drivers out on the road. Men like Mike who had families to feed. This freeze would hurt them too. Their fuel cards might stop working tonight. But I had a plan for them. I would take care of my people. I always did. It was the parasites in the executive suite I was exterminating. 3:58. I took a deep breath. The air in the study felt thin electric. "Goodbye, West Logistics," I whispered. I clicked send. The screen refreshed. Message sent. I imagined the scene at the bank headquarters downtown. I imagined the alert popping up on Sterling's screen. I imagined the panic as the risk officers scrambled to hit the kill switch before the clock struck 4. And then I imagined the scene at my old office. At 4:01 p.m. they would try to swipe a corporate card for dinner. Declined. At 4:05 p.m. the CFO would get a call from the bank telling him the payroll account was locked. By 4:10 p.m. the realization would set in. They had no money. They had no building. They had no trucks. I sat back in my chair and took off my glasses. My hands were trembling slightly, just like they had in the workshop this morning. But this time it wasn't rage. It was adrenaline. It was the feeling of a heavy load finally being secured. Henderson turned back from the window. "It is done," he said softly. "It is done," I replied. The bank was closed. The trap was sprung. Preston and Tiffany were locked in a cage of their own making, and they wouldn't even realize the door was shut until they tried to walk out. Now all we had to do was wait for the sun to go down. The Ghost Fleet protocol was next. If they thought losing the money was bad, wait until they saw 200 trucks disappear into thin air. I stood up and walked to the kitchen to pour 2 glasses of whiskey. One for me and one for Henderson. We had a long night ahead of us. The war had just begun. The sun had finally surrendered to the horizon, leaving the Texas sky a bruised purple before fading into absolute black. It was 8 o'clock at night. In the silence of my study, the only light came from the glowing embers of a cigar I shouldn't be smoking, and the hum of my computer tower. The whiskey in my glass was untouched. I needed a clear head for what came next. The bank freeze was the jab, a quick strike to the nose to stun them. But this next move, this was the uppercut. I picked up my burner phone, a cheap plastic device I had bought at a gas station on the way home. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang once. "Yeah, boss." The voice on the other end was deep, raspy, and sounded like it had been gargling gravel. It belonged to Mike Rodriguez, known in the yards as Mike the Bull. He was a former Marine gunnery sergeant who had done 3 tours in Fallujah before coming home to find that the country he fought for didn't have much use for a man with his specific set of skills. I hired him 15 years ago as a mechanic. Now he managed the entire fleet. He was the kind of man who didn't care about stock prices or quarterly projections. He cared about respect, and Preston had never given him any. "Are you in position, Mike?" I asked. "I am at the dispatch hub," Mike replied. "The night shift is on. The boards are green. Everyone is rolling." I took a breath. I looked at the map on my screen, the one showing 200 green dots moving across the arteries of America. Each dot was a truck. Each truck was a livelihood. "It is time," I said. "Execute Protocol 66. There was a pause on the line. A heavy silence. Mike knew what this meant. We had discussed this scenario years ago over beers back when I first started worrying about Preston's weakness. We called it the Ghost Fleet option. It was the nuclear deterrent. You are sure? Harlan Mike asked softly. Once we do this, there is no turning back. The reputation of the company takes a hit tonight. The company is already dead, Mike, I said, my voice hardening. We are just saving the parts. Do it. Understood. Out. The line clicked dead. I put the phone down and turned my attention to the large monitor on my left. This screen mirrored the main logistics dashboard at the headquarters. It was the pride and joy of the new IT director Preston had hired. It showed real-time GPS telemetry fuel consumption and estimated arrival times for every single load. For a minute, nothing happened. The green dots kept moving along Interstate 10 up the I-35 corridor and across the long, lonely stretches of West Texas. Then the first domino fell. A dot near El Paso blinked once, then turned gray, then black, then another one outside of Dallas, then 3 more in the Panhandle. It wasn't a glitch. It was a synchronized shutdown. Mike the Bull had just sent a priority broadcast message to every driver's cab terminal. The message was simple and coded. It told them that the company's insurance had been voided due to executive malpractice and that they were to pull over immediately at the nearest safe haven, secure their cargo, and shut down their engines until they heard from Harlon West personally. I watched the screen with a grim fascination. It was like watching a city go dark during a power outage. The map, which was usually alive with the pulse of commerce, was dying. 10 trucks stopped, then 50, then 100. The telemetry data started flatlining. Speed dropped to 0. RPMs dropped to 0. Ignition status changed to off. Out on the road, I knew exactly what was happening. 200 men and women loyal to the paycheck, but more loyal to the man who signed it, were pulling their massive 18-wheelers onto shoulders into rest stops and into truck stop parking lots. They were turning keys. They were locking doors. They were climbing into their sleeper berths and closing the curtains. In the span of 12 minutes, the entire fleet of West Logistics ceased to exist as a moving entity. We were ghosting the system. I shifted my gaze to the internal camera feed of the operations room at the headquarters. The reaction was delayed, which was typical for people who stared at spreadsheets instead of reality. It started with a frown from a junior dispatcher. He tapped his screen, looked confused, and refreshed the page. Then he stood up and looked over his cubicle wall at his neighbor. "Hey, did you just lose the signal on Unit 402?" he asked. "Yeah, I lost 402 and 405, the neighbor replied. System glitch. Then the phone started ringing. It wasn't the drivers calling. The drivers knew the drill. It was the customers. The first call came from a construction manager in Austin waiting for steel beams. Then a warehouse manager in Oklahoma City waiting for parts. The dispatchers picked up the phones, their faces pale. "Sir, the driver isn't answering the radio." I heard one dispatcher say on the audio feed, "I show him stopped, but I can't get a status update." Then the door to the operations room burst open. Preston and Tiffany stormed in. They looked disheveled. They had probably just finished screaming at the bank about the frozen accounts, and now they were walking into a burning building. "Why are the phones ringing off the hook?" Tiffany shrieked. She wasn't wearing her jacket anymore. Her hair was a mess. Mr. West, the shift supervisor, stammered, looking at Preston. "We have a situation. We are losing telemetry on the fleet." "What do you mean, losing?" Preston asked, his voice cracking. "Is it a server crash?" "No, sir. The signals are active. The trucks are just stopping. All of them." Preston rushed to the main wall of monitors. He stared at the sea of black dots. His eyes went wide. He grabbed a headset from the nearest desk. "Driver Unit 319, this is CEO Preston West," he shouted into the mic. "Report status immediately." "Why are you stopped?" Silence. Just the crackle of static. He tried another channel. "Unit 550, acknowledge." "This is an emergency, nothing." He didn't understand. He thought he was the boss. He didn't realize that in the world of trucking, the boss is the guy who ensures the paycheck clears and the tires don't blow. To those drivers, Preston was just a suit who cut their dental benefits last year. They weren't going to answer him. Tiffany pushed him aside and started typing furiously on the master console. She was trying to use the remote override, a feature that allowed the office to unlock doors or restart engines remotely in case of lost keys. I watched her fingers fly across the keyboard. She hit enter. On my screen, I saw the command come through, and I saw the system reject it. A large red dialog box popped up on the main wall in the operations room, visible to everyone. Access denied. Error code Omega override. Authorization required chairman level. Tiffany stared at the screen. She hit the keys again. Access denied. Contact asset owner. She spun around, her eyes wild, scanning the room as if I were hiding under a desk. She grabbed the supervisor by the collar. Who controls the root access? She screamed. Who locked the system? The supervisor was shaking. I don't know, ma'am. The system says asset owner. That is the holding company. Preston slumped against the wall. He slid down until he was sitting on the floor, his expensive suit gathering dust. He looked at the black screen. He finally understood. It's Dad, he whispered. Tiffany whipped around. What? It's Dad! Preston said louder, a hysterical giggle escaping his throat. He owns the trucks, Tiff. We lease them. He just revoked the lease. The phones were deafening now. It was a cacophony of ringtones. Every major client in the Southwest was calling to demand to know why their cargo was sitting on the side of the road. Contracts worth millions were being breached every second. Penalties were racking up faster than a slot machine. I watched Tiffany realize the magnitude of her mistake. She looked at the red error message. She looked at her husband on the floor. She looked at the phone in her hand. She knew she had to call me. She knew I was the only one who could turn the lights back on. I sat back in my chair and took a sip of the whiskey. It tasted smooth. The burn was gone. Let it ring, I said to the empty room. I wasn't going to answer. Not yet. They needed to sweat. They needed to feel the heat of the fire they had started. They needed to explain to Amazon and General Electric why West Logistics was ghosting them. I watched the chaos unfold for another hour. I saw employees walk out. I saw the IT director throw his badge on the desk and leave. I saw the empire of cards collapsing in real time. At 9:30, I finally closed the laptop. The show was over. The point was made. I stood up and stretched. My back ached, but it was a good ache. The ache of a hard day's work. Tomorrow would be the cleanup. Tomorrow would be the police. Tomorrow would be the rebuilding. But tonight, the highways were quiet. And for the first time in 3 years, I slept like a baby, knowing that my ghost fleet was standing guard, silent sentinels in the dark, waiting for their true commander to give the order. I woke up at 5 in the morning, just like I have every day for the last 50 years. There is a specific kind of silence that happens before the sun comes up. It is heavy and cool, and it smells like dew on the grass. Usually my mind would be racing with logistics at this hour. I would be thinking about fuel prices in the Midwest, or a driver stuck in a snowstorm in Colorado. But this morning my mind was completely empty. It was the peaceful emptiness of a man who had finally put down a heavy load. I walked into the kitchen, the floorboards creaking familiarly under my feet. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I liked the gray pre-dawn gloom. I filled the percolator with water and spooned in the coffee grounds. Dark roast, strong enough to strip paint. I listened to the rhythmic bubbling as the machine came to life, a sound that had been the soundtrack to my life since before Preston was born. While the coffee brewed, I put 2 slices of sourdough bread in the toaster. I buttered them while they were still hot, watching the butter melt into the golden crust. It was a simple breakfast. A poor man's breakfast, Tiffany would call it. She was probably used to avocado toast and mimosas by now. Or at least she was yesterday. Today I doubted she had much of an appetite. I sat down at the small wooden table in the breakfast nook. I placed my burner phone on the table next to my plate. I hadn't turned the ringer on. I didn't want the noise to disturb my morning, but I left it face up. The screen was black for about 10 seconds. Then it lit up. Preston West calling. I watched the name dance across the screen. I didn't reach for it. I just took a bite of my toast and chewed slowly, savoring the crunch. The screen went dark. Then it lit up again immediately. Preston West calling. He was persistent. I could imagine him on the other end. He probably hadn't slept. He was likely sitting in that glass office, tie undone, hair wild, surrounded by cold coffee cups and screaming telephones. He was probably staring at a dashboard full of red error messages, praying that his old man would finally pick up and tell him it was all just a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was a lesson. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot and bitter, just the way I liked it. The phone buzzed against the wood table again. This time the name changed. Tiffany West calling. I let out a short, dry chuckle. She must be desperate if she was calling me. Yesterday I was an embarrassment. Yesterday I was a relic to be discarded. Today, suddenly, I was the most important person in her world. She wasn't calling to apologize. I knew that. She was calling to threaten. She wanted to scream at me. She wanted to tell me I was illegal, that I was crazy, that she would sue me into oblivion. She didn't realize that you can't sue a man who holds the mortgage on your existence. I watched the call go to voicemail. Then came a number I didn't have saved in the burner phone, but I recognized the area code. It was the Dallas exchange for the corporate headquarters of First Texas Bank. That would be Sterling, or maybe his boss. They would be frantic. A frozen credit line on a company the size of West Logistics wasn't just a business problem, it was a compliance nightmare. They needed the guarantor to sign off on a release. They needed me to say it was a mistake. They called 3 times in a row. I just buttered another piece of toast. By the time the sun actually broke over the horizon, painting the kitchen in a wash of pale orange light, the notification counter on the lock screen had climbed steadily. 10 missed calls, 20, 35. At 46 missed calls, the phone finally stopped buzzing for a moment. It just sat there, glowing with the evidence of their panic. 46 times they had reached out into the void, and 46 times the void had answered with silence. I wondered if Preston remembered the times I called him when he was in college. Just to say hello, just to ask how his classes were going. He would send me to voicemail for weeks claiming he was too busy studying. He wasn't studying. He was partying on my dime. Now he knew what it felt like to be ignored. I finished my coffee and carried the cup to the sink. I washed it and placed it in the drying rack. Order, discipline. These were things Preston never learned. I walked into the living room and sat in my recliner. I picked up the remote and turned on the television. I didn't go to the cartoons or the Weather Channel. I tuned in to the National Financial News Network. Usually at this hour they were talking about tech stocks or oil prices. But today the ticker at the bottom of the screen caught my eye immediately. West Logistics operations halted, missing fleet, fraud allegations. I turned up the volume. A young woman in a sharp blazer was standing in front of a green screen showing a stock chart that looked like a cliff face. The line was plummeting straight down. Breaking news this morning from the transportation sector, the anchor said, her voice serious and urgent. West Logistics, one of the largest heavy haul carriers in the Southwest, has effectively ceased operations overnight. Reports are coming in that over 200 of their trucks have simply vanished from the roads, parked in undisclosed locations, by drivers who are refusing to communicate with dispatch. The screen cut to footage taken from a helicopter. It showed the West Logistics headquarters. The parking lot was empty of trucks. There were news vans parked on the grass where my Ford usually sat. But that is not all, the anchor continued. Sources close to the situation tell us that the company's credit facilities were frozen late yesterday afternoon following allegations of executive misconduct. Rumors are swirling about a massive embezzlement scheme involving the transfer of corporate reserves to a shell company in Delaware. I leaned back in my chair. Executive misconduct. Embezzlement. Those were heavy words. Words that stuck to you. Words that ruined careers. The camera cut back to the studio. We reached out to CEO Harlon West for comment, but have received no response, the anchor said. However, industry analysts are saying that without its fleet moving, the company is bleeding approximately $200,000 an hour in penalties and lost revenue. If the trucks do not move by noon, West Logistics could be facing insolvency by the end of the business day. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 7:15. They had 5 hours before total collapse. I saw a picture of Preston flash on the screen. It was his official headshot, the one where he looked confident and smug. Now that face was being plastered next to the words fraud and collapse. I felt a twinge of pain in my chest. No father wants to see his son destroyed on national television. I remembered holding him when he was a baby, promising to protect him. But then I remembered the text message, "Do not come back." I was protecting him. I was protecting him from a life of being Tiffany's puppet. I was stripping him down to the studs so he could maybe, just maybe, rebuild himself into a real man. The news anchor started talking about the impact on the supply chain, about factories shutting down because parts weren't arriving. "This is a ghost fleet situation," an expert commentator said on the screen. "It is unprecedented. It appears the owner of the assets, a holding company controlled by the founder Harlon West, has triggered a nuclear option in the lease agreements. This is not a business failure. This is a deliberate shutdown. They were figuring it out." I picked up the remote and muted the TV. The silence rushed back into the room, but it was different now. It wasn't empty. It was charged with the energy of a storm that had finally made landfall. I stood up and walked to the window. My driveway was empty, but I knew that wouldn't last long. They would come here. They had no choice. They couldn't call the police on me because I hadn't broken any laws. They couldn't sue me because they had no money for lawyers. Their only option was to come to my door and beg. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I looked old. My face was lined, my hair was white, but my eyes were clear. "Let them come," I said softly. I went back to the kitchen and poured myself a second cup of coffee. I checked the phone one more time. 47 missed calls. The latest one was from Henderson. I picked up the phone and dialed him back. He answered on the first ring. "Did you see the news?" Henderson asked. "I am watching it now," I said. "The bank just called my office," Henderson said, sounding tired but satisfied. "They are freaking out, Harlon. They want a meeting. They are talking about appointing a receiver to take over the company to protect their loan." "Tell them to wait," I said. "Wait for what? For the rats to abandon the ship," I said. "Preston and Tiffany are on their way here. I can feel it." "You want me to come over?" Henderson asked. "No," I said. "This is a family meeting. I need to look them in the eye without a lawyer present. I need to see if there is anything left of my son worth saving." "Be careful," Harlan Henderson warned. "Desperate people do dangerous things." "I know," I said. "I am counting on it." I hung up the phone. I took my coffee and walked to the front porch. I sat on the swing that I had built with my own hands 30 years ago. I watched the road. I listened to the birds singing in the oak trees. It was a beautiful morning. 10 minutes later, I saw the dust cloud rising in the distance. A car was speeding down the dirt road toward my house. It was moving too fast, swerving slightly. It was the Tesla. "Here we go," I whispered. I didn't stand up. I didn't put down my coffee. I just sat there and swung gently back and forth, waiting for the children to come home and face the music. The Tesla skidded to a halt on the gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on the hood of my truck. I didn't get up from the porch swing. I just took another sip of my coffee, feeling the ceramic mug warm against my calloused palms. The driver's door flew open before the car had even fully stopped rocking. Preston stumbled out. He looked like a man who had been dragged behind a horse for 5 miles. His tie was missing, his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a sheen of sweat, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a frightened child who had broken a vase and was waiting for the belt. Tiffany exited the passenger side a moment later. She wasn't stumbling. She was marching. Her pristine white suit from yesterday was wrinkled, and her makeup was smudged, but the rage radiating off her was hotter than the Texas sun. She slammed the door so hard I thought the window might crack. She pointed a manicured finger at me as she stormed up the walkway, her heels sinking into the dirt with every step. "You!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You crazy old man! Undo it! Undo it right now!" Preston ran to catch up with her, grabbing her arm, but she shook him off. They stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, panting. I looked down at them. It was a pathetic sight. 2 people who thought they owned the world yesterday were now standing in my front yard, begging for their lives. "Hi, son," I said calmly. "You look tired." "Don't you dare play the concerned father," Tiffany shrieked. She looked ready to charge up the stairs and attack me. "Do you have any idea what you have done? The bank accounts are frozen. The trucks are gone. The stock is trading at pennies. You have destroyed everything. You have ruined us." "I ruined nothing," I said, setting my coffee cup down on the small table beside the swing. "I simply took back what was mine. You were the ones who decided to play games with assets you didn't own." "Dad." "Please," Preston pleaded, his voice trembling. "It is not a game. We are facing jail time. The SEC is calling. The FBI is asking questions. You have to call the bank. You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. If you don't unfreeze the credit line by noon, they are going to seize the house. Our house, Dad. Where your grandchildren sleep." "We don't have children, Preston," I reminded him gently. "And that house belongs to the company, just like everything else." He flinched, as if I had slapped him. It was true. They had been trying for years or so, they said, but Tiffany was always too busy with her career, too busy building her brand. Now I wondered if that was a lie, too. I stood up slowly, my knees was popping. I walked to the edge of the porch and leaned against the railing, looking down at my daughter-in-law. She wasn't looking at me with fear. She was looking at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "I am going to sue you," she hissed. "I am going to sue you for breach of fiduciary duty. I am going to sue you for tortious interference. I will take this farm. I will take your truck. I will leave you rotting in a state-run nursing home." I laughed. It was a dry, raspy sound that seemed to startle the birds in the oak trees. "With what money, Tiffany?" I asked. "You can't even pay for the gas to get back to town. Your corporate cards are dead. Your personal accounts are linked to the guarantee. You are broke." She opened her mouth to scream again, but I cut her off. "Come inside," I said, turning my back on them. "We have business to discuss. And leave the attitude on the porch." I walked into the house without waiting to see if they followed. I knew they would. They had nowhere else to go. I went into the living room and sat in my leather armchair. On the coffee table in front of me sat a single manila folder. It was thick. It was labeled Nexus Tech. I heard the screen door slam. Preston and Tiffany walked into the living room. The air conditioning was humming, but the room felt suffocating. They stood there awkward and small in the house where Preston grew up. "Sit down," I commanded. "Before I open the folder sitting on that table, leave a comment with the number 1 so I know you're still here with me watching every moment. And just a quick note. The next part of this story includes some dramatized details for storytelling purposes. If you're not comfortable with that, you're free to stop the video here. They sat on the sofa opposite me. Preston slumped forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. Tiffany sat rigid, her back straight, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for a weapon. I reached forward and picked up the folder. I weighed it in my hand for a moment. So I began looking at Preston. You told me the investors were worried about my age. You told me the company needed to pivot to technology. You told me $5,000 a month was a generous offer. Preston didn't look up. It was just business, Dad. We needed to modernize. Modernize, I repeated. Is that what you call it? I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. I tossed them onto the table. They slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of Preston. Is stealing $15 million part of modernization? I asked. Preston looked up confused. What? The transfer to Nexus Tech, I said. $15 million in cash reserves. You authorized it yesterday. Or at least your credentials did. Preston blinked. That was for the software acquisition. Tiffany said we needed to buy the IP before the merger. It was a standard asset purchase. I looked at Tiffany. She wasn't looking at the papers. She was staring at me. Her face pale and tight. She knew. She knew exactly what was in that folder. Software acquisition, I said, letting the words roll around in my mouth like a bad taste. Is that what she told you, son? I pulled out another document. This one was the deed Henderson had found. Nexus Tech isn't a software company. Preston, I said, my voice dropping to a low growl. It is a shell company registered to a residential address in Boca Raton, Florida. Preston frowned. Boca Raton. Who lives in Boca Raton? I looked at Tiffany. Do you want to tell him, or should I? Tiffany stayed silent, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping in her cheek. Tell me what Preston looked between us, panic rising in his chest. The house belongs to Linda D'Amato, I said. Preston froze. He looked at his wife. Your mother, Tiffany, didn't move. Why would we be sending $15 million to your mother? Preston asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because she wasn't buying software, Preston, I said. She was cashing out. She was taking the money and running. I tossed the final document onto the table. It was a printout of an email chain Henderson's private investigator had intercepted. It wasn't easy to get, but money talks, and Henderson knew the right people. Read the email. Preston, I said. Preston reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the paper. He began to read. I watched his eyes move back and forth. I watched the color drain from his face until he looked like a ghost. It can't be, he stammered. This isn't real. Read it out loud, I ordered. Preston swallowed hard. He read, his voice shaking. Subject: flight arrangements. From Tiffany West to Mark Reynolds. He stopped. He looked up at me. Mark Reynolds, the CEO of Red Rock. Keep reading, I said. Message: the transfer is scheduled for Tuesday. Once the funds clear into Nexus, I will meet you in Rio. Preston will take the fall for the authorization. The old man is too senile to notice until it is too late. See you on the beach. The silence that followed was absolute. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Preston dropped the paper. It floated down to the table like a dead leaf. He turned his head slowly to look at his wife. The woman he had defied me for. The woman he had tried to destroy his own father for. Rio, he whispered. You were going to Rio with Mark Reynolds. Tiffany didn't deny it. She didn't cry. She didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, her face changed. The mask of the grieving, stressed executive dropped away, revealing something cold and ugly underneath. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You are such an idiot, Preston, she spat. You always were. Did you really think I was in love with you? You are a man-child, who still needs his daddy to tie his shoes. Tiffany. Preston choked out, tears streaming down his face. Oh, shut up, she snapped. I spent 5 years building you up. I spent 5 years trying to turn you into a man who could run a company. But you are weak. You are just like your father, obsessed with honor and loyalty and all that garbage. Mark Reynolds understands the real world. He understands that money is the only thing that matters. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. So congratulations, Harlon, she said, turning her cold eyes on me. You caught me. You stopped the transfer. You win. Are you happy now? You saved your precious company. You saved your pathetic son. She reached for her purse. I am leaving, she announced. I am going to call a cab. And don't think you can stop me. I haven't committed a crime. Attempting to transfer funds isn't illegal if it didn't go through. It was just a business strategy that failed. She started to walk toward the door. Preston sat frozen on the couch, broken, unable to move. I watched her walk. I waited until she was almost at the hallway. Sit down, Tiffany, I said. She stopped and looked back, sneering. Or what? You will ground me. No, I said. I won't. But the 2 FBI agents sitting in my kitchen might have a problem with you leaving. Her smirk vanished. What she whispered. I raised my voice slightly. You can come out now, gentlemen. The kitchen door swung open. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They were real federal agents. Henderson had called them the moment we found the email about the wire fraud conspiracy. Attempting to steal $15 million is absolutely a crime, especially when you use interstate wire systems to do it. It is called wire fraud, and conspiring to frame a CEO for it. That is just the cherry on top. Tiffany looked at the agents. She looked at the badges on their belts. For the first time since I had known her, she looked truly terrified. Her knees gave way, and she slumped against the doorframe. Preston looked up from the couch. He looked at the agents, then at his wife, then at me. Dad, he said, his voice broken. You called the FBI. I looked at my son. He was devastated. His life was in ruins. His marriage was a lie. His career was over. But he was free. He was finally free of the poison that had been killing him for years. I didn't call them on you, son, I said softly. I called them for her. One of the agents walked over to Tiffany and pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Ms. West, you have the right to remain silent, he recited. I watched as they clicked the cuffs onto her wrists. She didn't fight. She was in shock. She stared at me as they led her out the front door, her eyes wide with disbelief. She never thought the old man had it in him. She never thought I would pull the trigger. When the door closed, the room was quiet again. Just me and my son. Preston put his head back in his hands and began to sob. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. I stood up and walked over to him. I didn't say anything. I just put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed. It was a heavy hand, rough and calloused, but it was there. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't pull away. It is over, I said. But the lesson wasn't finished yet. There was still the matter of the company. There was still the matter of the future. And Preston had a long road ahead of him if he wanted to earn his way back. The blue and red lights flashing through the front window painted the living room walls in a chaotic rhythm of color. It was a silent light show at first, but then the sirens cut the air loud and piercing, announcing to the entire county that the West family empire had officially fallen. I watched the display from my armchair, my hands resting calmly on my knees. I had called the FBI 3 hours ago, right after Henderson confirmed the wire fraud. I didn't call the local sheriff. The sheriff plays poker with Preston. I called the federal field office in Dallas. When you cross state lines to steal $15 million, you don't get a ticket. You get an indictment. The 2 agents who had emerged from my kitchen were professional. They held Tiffany by the arms, not roughly, but with a grip that made it clear she wasn't going anywhere. She was still struggling to process the reality of the situation. She kept looking at the door, expecting her high-priced lawyers to burst in and stop this. But there were no lawyers coming. Not today. Henderson had made sure the evidence was airtight before we even made the call. The file on the coffee table wasn't just paper. It was a confession signed in digital footprints. More agents entered the house. They wore windbreakers with those 3 yellow letters on the back that strike fear into the hearts of corrupt executives everywhere. They moved with efficiency, securing the room, checking for weapons, though the only weapon in the house was the truth, and I had already fired it. I looked at Preston. He was sitting on the edge of the sofa, staring at the floor, his hands shaking violently. He looked small. The arrogance he had worn like a suit of armor yesterday was gone, stripped away by the revelation that his wife was planning to leave him for a beach in Brazil. He wasn't the mastermind. He was just the getaway driver, and he hadn't even known he was driving the car. One of the senior agents stepped forward holding a piece of paper. He looked at Tiffany. Tiffany West. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement of corporate funds, and insider trading. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The words hung in the air like smoke. Embezzlement. Insider trading. These weren't white-collar misunderstandings. These were felonies that carried decades in federal prison. Tiffany stopped struggling for a moment. She looked at the agent, then she looked at me. Her face twisted into a mask of pure venom. "This is a mistake," she shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "You can't arrest me. I am the CFO of West Logistics. That money was authorized. Ask him, ask my husband." She turned to Preston. "Tell them, Preston. Tell them we discussed it. Tell them it was for the acquisition." Preston didn't look up. He didn't speak. He just rocked back and forth, muttering something to himself that sounded like a prayer or a curse. When she realized Preston wasn't going to save her, Tiffany snapped. The veneer of the sophisticated businesswoman cracked and fell away, revealing the terrified grifter underneath. She started thrashing, trying to pull her arms free from the agents. "Get your hands off me," she screamed. "Do you know who I am? I will have your badges. I will sue you all." She turned her rage on me. "You did this, you old bitter man. You were jealous. You were jealous that we were going to be bigger than you ever were. You would rather burn it all down than let us succeed." I didn't flinch. I just watched her. Success, is that what she called stealing the retirement security of 200 families? "You were never building anything, Tiffany," I said, my voice cutting through her screams. "You were just stripping the copper out of the walls." The agents began to lead her toward the door. She dug her heels into my hardwood floor, scuffing the finish. She looked back at Preston one last time. "You coward," she yelled at her husband. "You pathetic, spineless coward. I should have left you years ago. Mark was twice the man you are." The mention of her lover's name seemed to be the final dagger. Preston flinched, as if he had been physically struck. The agents dragged Tiffany out the door, her screams fading, as they pushed her into the back of the waiting sedan. I watched through the window as she continued to kick at the glass, a woman who had spent her life believing she was untouchable, finally learning that gravity applies to everyone. The room fell silent again, save for the crackle of the police radios outside. The senior agent nodded to me. "We will need a statement from you, Mr. West, and we will need access to the server logs." "You will have everything you need," I said. "My lawyer is already sending the files." The agent looked at Preston. "We are going to need to speak with your son as well. Given the evidence in the emails, it appears he was being manipulated, but he still signed the authorization. He is a person of interest." "I understand," I said. The agent tipped his head and stepped outside to give us a moment. He knew this was the end of the line for my son, and he had the decency to let a father say goodbye. I stood up and walked over to where Preston was sitting. He looked like a ruin. His expensive shirt was stained with sweat. His face was gray. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with tears. He slid off the sofa and fell to his knees. It wasn't a theatrical gesture. His legs just gave out. He grabbed my hand, burying his face in my palm like he used to do when he was 5 years old and afraid of the thunder. "Dad," he sobbed. "Dad, I am sorry. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know she was stealing it. She told me it was legal. She told me it was the only way to save the merger." I looked down at him. I felt the wetness of his tears on my hand. My heart wanted to break. This was my boy. This was the child I had carried on my shoulders. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to pull him up, to hug him, to tell him that Daddy would fix it. I had the money. I had the lawyers. I could probably make a deal. I could claim he was mentally incompetent. I could save him from prison. But then I remembered the text message. "Do not come back." I remembered the look on his face yesterday in the parking lot while he hid behind the blinds. I remembered the drivers who had lost a day of pay because of his negligence. If I saved him now, I wouldn't be saving him. I would be enabling him. I would be confirming everything Tiffany had said about him being a weakling who needed his father to tie his shoes. I slowly pulled my hand away. Preston looked up, confused by the withdrawal of comfort. "Dad, help me. Please, talk to them. Tell them I was tricked. I was a victim here." I stepped back. I put a distance between us that felt wider than the Grand Canyon. "You were not a victim, Preston," I said. My voice was low, steady, and devoid of the pity he was looking for. "But she lied to me. She set me up. She lied to you because you wanted to be lied to," I said. "You wanted the fast cars. You wanted the big office. You wanted the feeling of being important without doing the work to earn it. That isn't being a victim, son. That is being a willing accomplice." Preston shook his head frantically. "No, Dad. I did it for the company. I did it for you." "Don't you dare," I snapped. "Don't you dare put this on me. You did it because you were greedy. You looked at $15 million and you didn't see the sweat of the men who earned it. You saw a beach house. You saw a private jet." I pointed to the door where Tiffany had been dragged out. "She was a shark, Preston. Sharks eat. That is what they do. But you were the one who opened the gate and let her into the swimming pool. You handed her the keys because you were too lazy to drive the truck yourself." Preston collapsed back onto his heels. The truth hit him harder than any physical blow. He stopped crying. He just stared at me, seeing me clearly for the first time in years. He realized that the safety net was gone. What is going to happen to me?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said honestly. "You are going to talk to the FBI. You are going to tell them the truth. You are going to testify against her. And then you are going to face whatever consequences the law decides. You aren't going to help me." I walked over to the window and looked out at the fleet of police cars. "I just did help you, Preston," I said without turning around. "I stopped you from becoming a fugitive in Brazil. I stopped you from losing your soul completely. But I am not going to pay your bail. And I am not going to hire your lawyer." I turned back to him. "You wanted to run the company, Preston. You wanted to be a man. Well, this is the first day of your new job. Being a man means cleaning up your own mess." Preston lowered his head. He understood. For the first time in his life, there was no check coming to clear the balance. The agent walked back into the room. "Mr. West, we need to take him in for questioning now." I nodded. "Take him." Preston stood up shakily. He held his hands out for the cuffs. He didn't look at me as they walked him out. He looked straight ahead, walking into a future that was terrifying and uncertain, but finally, rightfully, his own. I stood alone in the empty house. The sirens faded as the convoy drove away. The silence returned heavy and absolute. I looked at the coffee table where the files lay scattered. I looked at the empty spot on the wall where a family photo used to hang. It was done. The cancer was cut out, but the patient was still bleeding. I walked to the kitchen and picked up my phone. It was time to make the call that mattered. It was time to call Mike. It was time to tell the ghost fleet to wake up. The king was dead. Long live the king. And this time the king was going to make sure the kingdom was built on rock, not sand. It took 3 days for the dust to settle after the flashing lights faded from my driveway. 3 days of lawyers' depositions and federal agents combing through terabytes of data. Tiffany was denied bail, labeled a flight risk due to her one-way ticket to Rio. Preston, however, was released. He had turned state's witness, handing over every password, every email, and every conversation he had recorded. He wasn't innocent, but he was useful, and in the eyes of the law, that was enough to keep him out of a cell for now. He came back to the house on a Tuesday morning. He didn't drive the Tesla. The bank had repossessed it yesterday, along with the furniture in his oversized house. He arrived in a taxi. He stood on the porch wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt, carrying a single duffel bag. He looked 10 years older than he had last week. The arrogance was gone, scrubbed away by the reality of losing everything. I met him at the door. I didn't invite him in for coffee. I walked past him down the steps and headed toward the barn. He followed me silently, like a ghost haunting his own life. We stopped in front of the old garage where I kept the spare equipment. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They weren't electronic fobs. They were jagged metal keys on a simple wire ring. I tossed them to him. He caught them with both hands, looking at them confusedly. "Unit 401, I said. "It is a 2010 Freightliner. It has 300,000 miles on it, no air conditioning in the sleeper, and the clutch is stiff. It is sitting in the back lot." Preston looked at the keys, then at me. "Dad, I don't understand." I reached into the barn and pulled out a bundle wrapped in plastic. I threw it at his chest. He fumbled but caught it. It was a neon yellow safety vest and a gray work shirt with the name trainee stitched over the pocket. "You said you wanted to run this company, Preston," I said, leaning against the barn door. "You said you wanted to be the boss." "Well, the boss needs to know how the wheels turn. You can't steer a ship if you have never touched the rudder." Preston stared at the shirt. "You want me to drive? I want you to learn," I corrected him. I spoke to the fleet manager. "You start tomorrow at 5 a.m. You are going to run the short-haul route from Lubbock to Amarillo. You are going to load your own freight. You are going to check your own tires. And you are going to get paid $15 an hour, just like every other rookie who walks through that gate." $15, Preston whispered. "Dad, I can't live on that." "Then you better learn how to budget," I said. "You wanted a handout, Preston. You wanted the title without the work. That is what got you into this mess. Now I am giving you something better than money. I am giving you a chance to earn your dignity back." I watched him struggle. I saw the flash of the old entitlement trying to rise up, trying to argue that this was beneath him. But then he remembered the handcuffs. He remembered Tiffany laughing at him. He realized that this stiff clutch and low wage was the only lifeline he had left. He gripped the keys tighter. "Thank you," he said softly. "Don't thank me yet," I replied, turning to walk away. "Thank me when you can back a 53-foot trailer into a dock without hitting the wall. Until then, you are just an expense." I left him standing there holding his new life in his hands. It was a harsh start, but it was the only way to forge steel. You have to apply heat and pressure. I climbed into my Ford F-250 and drove to the headquarters. The mood at the gate was different today. The security guard, a new guy I had hired to replace Tiffany's contractors, waved me in with a smile. The parking lot was full again. The Tesla was gone from the founder's spot, and I pulled my truck in, claiming the space that had always been mine. When I walked through the double doors, the silence that had plagued the building for days was gone. It was replaced by the low hum of conversation, the ringing of phones, and the clicking of keyboards. But it wasn't the frantic, panicked noise of last week. It was the sound of work, Mike. The bull was waiting for me in the lobby. He was wearing his grease-stained cap, holding a clipboard. He didn't say a word. He just extended a hand the size of a catcher's mitt. I shook it. "Good to see you." "Harlon," Mike grunted. "Good to be back, Mike," I said. "What is the status? Fleet is ready," he said. "Drivers are standing by in 40 states. They have been parked for 3 days. They are getting restless. They want to know if the checks are going to clear." I walked past him toward the main operations floor. The staff stopped what they were doing as I entered. These were the survivors. The ones who hadn't walked out. The ones who had stayed loyal to the brand, not the executive suite. They watched me with a mix of awe and relief. I walked straight to the main control console, the same place where Tiffany had screamed in frustration just days ago. The screens were still black, showing the error message, "System locked. Asset owner authorization required." I sat down in the chair. It felt comfortable. It felt right. I typed in my credentials. Not the admin backdoor this time, but the primary command code. Authorization HWest001. Password. The screen flickered. The red error box vanished. A progress bar appeared. Reestablishing satellite uplink. 10%, 40%, 80%. I looked up at the massive wall of monitors. Connection established. One by one, the lights began to pop on. Green dots appeared on the map of the United States. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami. The ghost fleet was becoming visible again. The telemetry data started to flow. Oil pressure readings, location pings, speed indicators. I picked up the dispatch microphone. I pressed the button that broadcasted to the entire fleet on the all-call channel. All units, this is Harlon West," I said, my voice steady and clear. "The lockout is over. The storm has passed. Payroll has been funded, and your fuel cards are active. Start your engines. Let's move some freight." A cheer went up from the dispatch floor. On the speakers, I heard the static-filled replies of 200 drivers honking their horns and revving their engines across the country. "Copy that, Harlon. Good to have you back, boss." Rolling out from Tulsa. Wheels turning in Denver. I sat back and watched the map come alive. It was beautiful. It was a symphony of logistics, and I was the conductor. We had lost millions in revenue, sure. The reputation had taken a hit. But we had survived. And more importantly, we had cleansed the rot. I spent the rest of the day in meetings reassuring clients, signing checks, and putting out fires. By the time the sun began to set, the office was quieting down again. I walked up the stairs to the second floor to the corner office. The nameplate on the door still said Preston West. I took a small screwdriver from my pocket and removed it. I slipped it into my pocket. I would have a new one made tomorrow. Maybe one day, if he worked hard enough, if he learned respect, his name would go back up there. But not today. I entered the office. It smelled like expensive cologne and stale ambition. I opened the windows to let the fresh Texas air in. I sat down at the heavy oak desk. I opened the top drawer. There, pushed to the back, was the cardboard box Tiffany had dropped in the parking lot. I had brought it back inside earlier. I pulled out the picture of Martha. I had replaced the broken glass with a new piece I cut myself in the workshop. She looked radiant in the photo, forever young, forever kind. I placed the photo on the desk facing me. I picked up my coffee cup and looked at her. "We made it, Martha," I whispered. I thought about Preston sleeping in the bunk of a truck tonight, his muscles aching, his ego bruised. It was going to be a long road for him. But at least he was on the road. At least he wasn't in a cell. And at least he wasn't living a lie. I looked around the office. I thought about the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the anger. It would have been easy to give up. It would have been easy to take the $5,000 and fade away. But that isn't who I am. I looked directly at the camera, breaking the fourth wall for the final time. They say you can't choose your family, I said, my voice low and reflective. And that is true. You are born into blood. But loyalty, respect, those are choices. And sometimes you have to be willing to burn the family tree to save the roots. I took a sip of coffee. My son thought I was obsolete. He thought I was just an old man in the way of his future. He forgot that the old man built the road he was driving on. I leaned forward. If you are listening to this and you feel like someone is taking advantage of you because you are kind or because you are family, remember this. You are the guarantor of your own life. You hold the keys. Don't be afraid to shut down the engine if the driver is heading off a cliff. I smiled, a genuine, tired smile. My name is Harlon West. I am a truck driver. I am a father. And I am still here. I placed the cup down. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to use tough love to save someone you cared about? I read every single one. I reached out and clicked off the desk lamp. The office plunged into shadow, illuminated only by the city lights outside and the steady green glow of the fleet map on the wall, beating like a strong, healthy heart. I am signing off. See you on the next run. The screen faded to black. They say the first winter is the hardest for a rookie driver, and Texas winters can be deceiving. One minute it is sunny, and the next ice storms sweep across the plains, turning the highways into skating rinks. 6 months had passed since the day I took back my company, and West Logistics was back in the black. The ghost fleet was no longer a ghost. It was a machine running at full capacity. But I wasn't watching the profit margins today. I was watching a single GPS dot moving slowly along Interstate 40, heading toward Amarillo, with a load of wind turbine blades. The truck was Unit 401. The driver was Preston West. I sat in my office sipping hot coffee, looking at the rain lashing against the window. Preston had not quit. I expected him to last a week. I expected him to throw the keys in the dirt and beg for a desk job. But he surprised me. He surprised everyone. He had lost 30 pounds. His hands, once soft and manicured, were now stained with grease and calloused from tightening chains. He lived in the sleeper cab 5 days a week. He ate at truck stops. He showered with a timer. He was learning the value of $1 by earning it 15 at a time. My phone rang. It was Henderson. Harlan Henderson said, his voice sounding satisfied. The verdict is in. I turned away from the window. And guilty on all counts, Henderson said. Wire fraud, conspiracy, insider trading. The judge didn't buy her tears. She got 12 years, Harlan. Minimum security, but still. 12 years. She will be 52 when she gets out. I felt a heavy weight lift off my chest. 12 years. It was a tragedy in a way. A waste of intelligence and drive. But it was justice. Does Preston know? I asked. I just called him, Henderson said. He didn't say much. He just asked if he could send her some money for the commissary. And what did you tell him? I told him that was up to him. But considering he is making trainee wages, he might want to save it for new tires. I chuckled. Good work, Saul. Send the bill to the company. I hung up. I looked back at the GPS screen. Unit 401 had stopped at a rest area just outside of Childress. I grabbed my jacket and my keys. I felt the need to see him. Not as a boss checking on an employee, but as a father checking on his son. I drove my pickup truck north, fighting the wind and the rain. It took me 2 hours to reach the rest stop. I found his truck parked in the back row away from the owner-operators with their chrome rigs. His Freightliner was dirty, caked in road grime. I parked next to it and climbed up the steps. I knocked on the door. The curtain parted and Preston looked out. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he had grown a beard that was more gray than black. When he saw me, he didn't panic like he used to. He just nodded and unlocked the door. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice rough from lack of use. I climbed into the passenger seat. The cab smelled like diesel stale coffee and pine sol. It was clean, though. Much cleaner than his office ever was. "I heard about Tiffany," I said. Preston nodded. He picked up a thermos and poured himself a cup of lukewarm water. 12 years, he whispered. She thought she was going to own the world. Now she is going to be running a laundry press for 12 cents an hour. "Do you miss her?" I asked. Preston looked out the windshield at the rain. "I miss who I thought she was. But that person never existed, did she? She was just a reflection of what I wanted to be. Rich, powerful, fast." He took a sip of water. "You know, Dad, yesterday I blew a tire outside of Lubbock. It was raining harder than this. I was on the side of the road, in the mud, trying to jack up the trailer. My knuckles were bleeding. Cars were flying past me at 80 miles an hour, splashing dirty water in my face." He paused, and I asked. "And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel useless," he said. I changed the tire. I got back in the truck, and I delivered the load on time. Nobody helped me. Nobody did it for me. I did it. He looked at me, and his eyes were clear. "I slept better last night than I ever slept in that $5 million house, Dad." I reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. It felt solid. "You are doing good work, son," I said. "Mike tells me your logs are perfect. Your fuel efficiency is up in the top 10%. "I am trying," Preston said. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a promotion. It was a deed. "What is this?" Preston asked. "It is the deed to that small house on Elm Street," I said. "The one the company uses for visiting drivers. It is small, 2 bedrooms, needs a new roof, but it is empty." Preston looked at the envelope, then at me. "You can move in this weekend," I said. "No rent, but you pay the utilities, and you fix the roof yourself." Preston took the envelope. His hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear, from gratitude. "Thank you, Dad," he said. "Don't be late for your delivery," I said, opening the door. "Wind turbines don't install themselves." I climbed down from the truck and watched him pull away. The gears ground a little. He still needed to work on his shifting, but the truck moved forward. He was moving forward. I drove back to the headquarters with a smile on my face. The company was safe. The family was broken, yes, but it was healing. It was healing the only way bone heals, by breaking and being set straight. When I walked into the lobby, there was a young man sitting in the waiting area. He was wearing a cheap suit, looking nervous, clutching a resume. He looked a lot like Preston did 20 years ago. "Can I help you, son?" I asked. I am here for an interview," the young man stammered. "For a junior analyst position." I looked at him. I looked at his soft hands and his eager eyes. "Do you know how to change a tire?" I asked. He blinked. "Excuse me, if you want to work here," I said, "you don't start at a desk. You start in the yard. You wash the trucks. You learn what they smell like. You learn what the drivers go through. Then maybe we talk about spreadsheets." The young man looked confused. "But I have an MBA." I laughed. "So did my son. And now he is the best rookie driver in Texas." I walked past him toward my office. "If you are still here in 10 minutes, go find Mike the Bull in the garage." I called back over my shoulder. "Tell him Harlan sent you. Tell him you want to get your hands dirty." I sat down at my desk and looked at the picture of Martha again. The sun was starting to break through the clouds outside. "We did it, Martha," I whispered. "We didn't just save the business. We saved the boy." I pulled up the fleet map on my screen. 201 green dots. 201 heartbeats pumping life into the American economy. I am Harlon West. And as long as I have breath in my body, and to you listening to this story, remember this. I'm not sharing this as a victory speech. I'm sharing it as a confession. I thought being strong meant staying silent. I thought providing meant controlling everything. That belief shaped this family story, and it nearly destroyed the people I loved most. God gave me wisdom long before the crisis came, but I ignored it. God placed responsibility in my hands, yet I mistook authority for distance. And God gave me family, but I believed love meant shielding them from consequences instead of teaching them truth. That was my failure. If this family story carries one lesson, let it be this: don't wait until betrayal forces clarity. Speak earlier. Set boundaries sooner. Love without accountability becomes a quiet form of harm. I'm not telling you to admire my choices, learn from my mistakes. Don't become the man I was before everything collapsed. These are the kinds of grandpa stories that aren't meant to glorify revenge, but to pass down hard-earned wisdom. Every grandpa story's moment is a warning wrapped in memory. And every family story that survives the fire does so because someone finally chose truth over comfort. That's why grandpa stories still matter. They aren't about the past. They're about preventing the same pain from repeating. This family story isn't unique. It's just honest. And honest grandpa stories don't ask for applause. They ask you to reflect. If this story resonated with you, I invite you quietly to leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. If you believe stories like this still have value, consider sharing it or subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know. Thank you sincerely for staying with me until the very end. And one final note: upcoming stories may include certain fictionalized elements thoughtfully added for educational and storytelling purposes. If that's not what you're looking for, you're free to step away and choose content that better suits you.